The irony of the fact that I'm sharing this episode, an episode about what we're doing differently in our own ceramics business, an episode where I was planning on sharing about how this year's market season is so much more reasonably paced, how we're striking better balances and communicating more smoothly. The irony of the fact that I'm sharing this episode this week, our one time this entire year with back-to-back market weekends, which also happens to kick off what has actually turned out to be our busiest time of year. Yeah, needless to say, what I originally had planned to share in this episode of The Launch, well, it's a little bit different than I first thought. And if this introduction sounds confusing to you and you've never heard me talk about the Launch series, let me explain real quick. The Launch is a series that peeks behind the scenes of launching our own ceramic business, Caraterra, sharing in as real time as possible the decisions that Francesco and I are making and why, the lessons we've already learned, how we're sticking to a plan or might be pivoting based on new information, and a lot more details because starting a business is, quite frankly, a wild ride, even if I've done it a few times before. And while hindsights from the pros that I've interviewed here on the podcast can be absolutely insightful, it's not quite the same as experiencing it in mostly real time. While you are welcome to scroll on back to episode number 406 when I first started the Launch series, it's also not entirely crucial to listen to these in order. So if your hands are already muddy and you don't want to fiddle around with touching buttons or screens, no worries. Keep on working away in the studio. Enjoy this episode, hopefully, and then afterwards, if you enjoyed it, click the link in the details of this episode and you can check out the full series so far. So, about this whole more balanced schedule, smoother communication, magical changes that we've made in 2024 for ourselves and our business, well, let's get right into all of that after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online source for research and inspiration, featuring photos of objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great source for students and teachers. To find out more, visit www.rosenfieldcollection.com. This episode is also sponsored by the Archie Bray Clay Business, home of Bray Patch, a ceramic patching material that is best used for filling cracks and bonding breaks. Bray Patch can be applied to either green or bisqueware and fired up to cone 10. It fires paper white but can be tinted using your chosen clay body and be covered by opaque glaze or slip. Order anytime online at archiebrayclay.com. Now, on with the show. Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the show where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, seasoned entrepreneur of 14 years, Rebecca Ikes Cara. First, let's start with a little recap since it's been a while since we had one of these episodes. While legally speaking, our ceramics business kicked off in 2021, it wasn't until last summer, the summer of 2023, that we started selling at any kind of in-person market or festival. The first 2 years were spent predominantly creating a functional home production studio, researching clay options, researching and testing glaze recipes, and selling on Etsy or through word of mouth. And for the sake of clarity, since transparency is literally why I started this podcast, we could take our time a bit slower in those first 2 years because I was still very much full-time in the world of event photography. And so my photography business was the primary income source for us as a household. Also, to clarify, when I say we were selling on Etsy, in reality, that was and is almost entirely one item, the infamous giant mug. Coming in at 24 ounces of liquid, this listing to this day generates consistent sales for us. Now, I won't get into the numbers and the details of how all of that is because I covered a lot more of that strategy back on episode number 509, entitled Etsy versus your own website. So check that out if you're interested in that. However, while we're on the clarifying train here, when I say that in those first 2 years, we were either selling the giant mug on Etsy or making sales through word of mouth, I don't only mean our direct personal friends kind of word of mouth, people whose houses we have spare keys to or whose kids we babysit. In fact, one of our largest singular orders in those first 2 years came from a fellow Potter friend who we've never actually met in person. Christine, a member of the community, had gotten an inquiry for a 200 mug order that needed to be delivered in a very short amount of time. The scope was outside of what she was able to take on at that time, and she referred this customer over to us. And I share that because I know for me, when I was first starting my photography business, when I would hear someone say word of mouth, I thought only of really direct relationships, immediate family members, best friends, or even the very direct word of mouth of a past client to a potential future client. I didn't think about the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, or more universally known, the 6 degrees of separation type of effect that is far more likely to be the source of quote-unquote word of mouth business growth. So if you feel like you've tried word of mouth and it doesn't work for you, your family and friends and close inner circle of people know you make pots, they've in fact even bought some or gifted some or told a friend about your work once, well, this is just a random, unsolicited bit of advice to maybe try and broaden the ideas of what word of mouth could really mean, right? But I digress. Let's get back to the recap. So, the first 2 years, getting the studio and the workspaces physically set up, selling the giant mug on Etsy, taking on commissions or referral orders, large and small. And then last year, we added in-person markets to the mix. And we participated in a variety of types of markets. Anything from the 4-hour Saturday morning farmers market near our neighborhood to the more traditional 2-day art festivals. Some were really successful, and some were not. And at one point, we had 5 weekends in a row of almost all 2-day markets. Needless to say, the first thing we're doing differently this year, well, we are not doing 5 weekends in a row again, or probably ever. This year, our market schedule has turned out to be pretty darn reasonable. And I say turned out, but it's not an accident. We were more intentional about what we applied for in order to have a schedule like this. We have roughly a show every 2 weeks, with the exception of this week, where we had a 2-day art festival last weekend, which actually turned out to be one of our strongest sales weekends to date, and we have another one this weekend. Go figure. It's the only time this year that that's happening, and the one time we still needed to have inventory in a short period of time naturally turns out to be an awesome weekend of selling lots of pots. So, as you might have guessed, yes, the kiln is currently running as I record this episode. However, we did have 3 weeks without any shows leading up to this back-to-back situation, so we did have some more inventory than earlier in the year. From what we learned last year, we chose not to do nearly as many shows in September and even October, which actually last year was the period of time where we had 5 weeks in a row. And as crazy as those 5 weeks in a row were, in a way, doing that is actually what allowed us to make the decision to not do shows in October this year. Because we could notice the change in the popularity of shows and therefore the change in the sales results as they shifted from one month to the next or 1 week to the next. In late September and early October, we started hearing murmuring about people thinking about holiday gifting and that one of our pieces might be great as a gift for a friend, but not actually buying those holiday gifts. It seemed to be a little too early to be making decisions. So this year, we decided to skip those late September and early October shows in order to give ourselves a better lead-up time to the November and December shopping mania. Clearly, we are being so smart this year. Or rather, we were. Because sometimes even the best laid plans are just that, plans, not necessarily reality. As luck would have it, this year we are accepted into not one, but two of the largest shows we know about and are within a 90-minute driving radius of where we live. First, earlier in the summer, we found out we got into One of a Kind, which is a 4-day event inside of the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. Now, putting that into better perspective for you, One of a Kind is a show that takes up an entire floor of the Merchandise Mart. And the Merchandise Mart takes up an entire city block of downtown Chicago. The building literally has its own zip code. Needless to say, we are thrilled and a little bit nervous. So appropriately, after our savvy lessons that we learned last year, we decided to not continue to apply to any shows in November, even the ones we were really interested in. And the only event we'll have in October is one of our favorite shows from last year, the Milwaukee Studio Tour. The studio tour is where we get to host other artists at our home, have people come and see where we make our work in the studio, meet neighbors, and generally just hang out in the backyard talking about art and hopefully selling a little bit of that art all weekend long. So, it's a pretty fantastic plan, right? Aren't you so proud of me for not overcommitting? Well, fast forward about a month after we hear the news of our acceptance into One of a Kind, and we get an email from Renegade, a national tour of shows whose flagship event is the September Fair in the Wicker Park neighborhood of Chicago. Now, we had applied last year but got turned down to this show, but this year we got in. Wow. One of a Kind and Renegade? I'm pretty excited, but I also know I get a little too excited and overcommit. So we sit down, Francesco and I, and look at the schedule and decide. Since Renegade is September 7th and 8th, early in the month, that will still give us enough time to prepare for December. So let's do it. We're all in. This is the year of change and making it happen, right? We've still applied our lessons learned from last year. It's still manageable. Because I also haven't told you about the marriage-saving daily morning meetings we started when we had this discussion, giving us both a clear time of day to ask all the questions we have of each other. Who's doing what? Who's waiting on the thing from the other person before they can do their thing? And where the heck are we at with that project we talked about doing last week? I thought you were doing it. No, I thought you were doing it. Well, we implemented this brilliant morning meeting, allowing us to mostly stop interrupting each other when we're actually getting work done. Now, I could write an entire podcast episode on the pros and cons and fascinating differences of starting a business on your own versus one with a partner, but the summary would be the pro, you are not alone. And the con? You are not alone. On the whole, compared to our throw absolutely everything at the wall and see what sticks strategy of 2023, 2024 is much calmer, while still showing some much needed growth. We are building a business that not only can ultimately be financially sustainable, but equally important, is sustainable to the lifestyle we want to have. We talk a lot about our definition of enough, and a lot less about year-over-year percentage sales growth. Because building a business that you have to put before your life is a lesson I already learned the hard way, and not at all one I'm interested in going back to. Alongside this new business communication strategy of ours, not even strategy, just system, daily meetings at set times so we know when we can talk about stuff, we've been testing out some theories that continued to pop up from last year's experiences. Theories like whether or not mugs are actually the most popular item to sell at summer markets. And spoiler, at the time of recording this episode, if we disregard Etsy, we have sold 25 mugs in total all year. And yet, we've hit our goals of 10 times a booth fee at a number of different markets already. Yes, my friends, we might just be growing a ceramics business that's not reliant on mugs? Question mark? It's a little crazy. We'll see where it goes. So on top of that crazy concept, we've also stopped having our online shop available. Or at least it's not always available. Now, I'm not talking about the Etsy here. That is trucking along smoothly, and we continue to let it do its thing for us. But our online web shop on our personal website, caraterra.com, is not always open to shop from. And yes, if you are wondering you're hearing this correctly, we do have both an Etsy and our own online shop. That is a big thing I talk about in that episode number 509 I mentioned already. So, while our sales systems are all synced up to manage inventory, so having different shopping locations wasn't structurally all that difficult, the mental weight of trying to keep the web shop fresh and interesting to encourage people to come back and shop, while also working on market inventory and restaurant partnerships and Etsy giant mugs, it just wasn't serving us. Also, in keeping these various sales avenues stocked, we weren't left with time to play and try out new ideas. So this year, we're trying something new. Our web shop will be open for limited weeks out of the year, with very specific limited collections. We're also setting a very specific timeline for when we accept dinnerware commission orders, as that was something that added a lot of complexity last year during market season. This whole approach is brand new and absolutely a pure hypothesis, so there's not a lot more for me to share just yet. But it is a hypothesis that I'm sure I will share more on in the coming months. Now, another theory we've been testing is my own personal marketing theory, where instead of trying to build up an Instagram of tens of thousands of followers who anxiously await a shop update and we sell out in minutes, that business model we see so frequently online for potters, and frankly, it would be a goal that would literally take years to get to, and I don't know if you remember, but I sort of semi-quit weddings this year, or at least I have very, very few photography gigs. In other words, I have like 5. I have 5 significant photography clients. 1 wedding, 4 corporate, and remember at the beginning of this episode where I said the photography business was the bread and butter of our household income? So yeah, spending years investing a ton of time into an online audience, maybe that audience will come eventually, but for us right now, it's not feeling like the savvy thing to do for a business that we need to be independently sustainable in about a year. So instead, I started focusing our content on Instagram on the excitement we have for becoming a part of the restaurant and hospitality industry, with a little bit of time-sensitive market announcements mixed in order to stay connected with the fantastic people that we continue to meet at those markets. Now, long story short, instead of thinking about online marketing as a way to reach new people, I'm using it as a way to stay connected with the real-life humans we've already met. And you know what's so cool about that? It makes all the Instagram best practices we learned from Allie Mason back in April during her masterclass inside of the community so much easier. Comment on someone's post with something genuine to say? No problem. Build trust by connecting like you would in real life? Well, I already know them in real life. Easy peasy. And just for the record, if you are curious about that masterclass, it definitely was recorded and is still in our ever-growing library of resources in the community. So you can come find that at makersplaybook.com/community. Anyway, with this little slice of clarity on how to make social media more manageable for myself, well, I sort of blew up our entire beautifully paced fall market schedule. Thanks to one post that was connected to one in real life partnership, I tagged a real life chef that we already know personally and who we work with in a post where I was recapping all that happened over the course of the last month. That real life chef shared the post to his stories. And another real life chef, who we did not know at the time, sent us a message. And now, sandwiched between Renegade on September 7th and 8th and 4 days of sales at the start of December, is an incredible 250-piece order with a restaurant that will be reopening at the start of October. Oops. So, what exactly are we doing differently this year compared to last? Well, I guess the moral of the story is that sometimes when the right opportunity comes along, you just have to say yes. And then go ask your friend who's only a couple miles away if you can borrow their kiln for a few weeks so you can fire twice as much stuff in the same amount of time. But really, the key phrase I just said there was the right opportunity. Last year, we said yes to just about any opportunity. And while you could hear this and think the advice is, don't be so crazy, I might actually suggest the opposite. In the early days of any venture, you simply don't know what you don't know. Yes, you can research. Yes, you can talk to peers. And from those things, you can make educated guesses at what you think might work the best for you. But it's not until you actually try it that you'll actually know for yourself. The biggest thing I've personally noticed over these last 4 months of markets is just how much we were able to apply observations and lessons we learned from last year in order to keep moving forward in the direction we want the business to grow. And I'm not talking about making bacon makers or butter bells because so many people asked us about them last year. No shade on anybody making butter bells. If you love to make them, awesome, go for it. And please send me a link to yours, because I will happily tell whoever asks me about where they can get one this weekend, where they can find yours. They just aren't something we want to make. In fact, there isn't a single thing in our booth that is there because someone asked for it to be made. However, what is there are more of the items that our favorite customers from last year did buy. Or bought, rather. And there are more of the typically smaller items that someone bought initially before coming back and buying something else. And I know what you're probably thinking right now. What are they, Rebecca? Tell us so that we know what to make for the rest of market season. But here's the catch, my friend. Whatever our thing is, probably isn't your thing. Francesco and I make minimalistic utilitarian pottery. I am absolutely confident that the serving bowl we might sell the most wouldn't necessarily be the same size or the same shape that sells the most for the potter specializing in detailed sgraffito work. The point is, my current hypothesis for explaining the growth we are gratefully seeing this summer is entirely rooted in observations. Just about every potter I've ever talked to will say that they make mugs because mugs sell. But last summer, we quickly noticed that while the giant mug might constantly sell online, we barely sell them at markets. That observation made us curious. So we asked why. Why aren't mugs selling as well in person as online? Is it because it's summer and it's warm outside? Is it because of who the online audience is versus who we meet in person? Is it because of the price point for some neighborhoods versus others versus a nationwide neighborhood? Is it because of how people discover our work when they're casually walking around a market while they're hanging out with a friend versus intentionally typing something into a search bar? We are constantly in a state of asking ourselves questions, particularly questions starting with why? Now, of course, there are often too many variables at play to come up with scientifically provable answers. But as we keep asking those why questions, we can guess at some trends. And then, the thing we're doing differently most of all this year, as compared to last year, is that we're making decisions based upon those trends we observed last year, instead of making decisions on the information our peers or friends told us about or what the internet shouts at us. This is all sounding very philosophical, so let me try and give a clearer example here. Last year, leading up to our first market ever, I was convinced that there would be two things that would be the most popular selling items, and therefore we needed to make the most in preparation. The first item? Obviously, mugs. And most likely our giant mug, since that already had a proven track record for selling online. And the second item? What I call impulse purchases. Small items around roughly $25 that people never planned on buying, but they saw and loved and on impulse purchased, because they were also priced at about the same dollar amount as that shirt you just bought from Target that you don't actually need, but you bought anyway when all you were doing was walking in for face wash and shampoo. Hypothetically, right? However, the first thing we actually sold at that first ever market, a $70 serving platter. In fact, we didn't sell a single mug at that entire market. Was this a random fluke or something to consider for the future? Well, we started testing it out. Why were singular, more expensive statement piece items selling more than mugs? Was it because they are items that don't need a matching set in people's minds? Was it because they're gifts? Was it because they were underpriced? Was it because of where I had them located in the booth or on display? The list of questions can go on and on. And as artisans trying to figure out how to make a living from the things we make, it is effectively our responsibility to try to find the answers to what is an endless list of questions. And yes, that can be exhausting. But if there's one common thread I see amidst the people I would call personally successful self-employed people, it's this. They are all curious. They are all willing to constantly ask questions. And perhaps equally important, constantly learn new things. When I first started my photography business 14 years ago, one of the things I would tell people I loved the most was that I got to use 110% of my brain every day. I wasn't slated into one position doing one thing over and over again as a person who would potentially be in part of a bigger team. I wasn't only doing one step of a process. Instead, I got to decide the entire process. Now, 14 years later, that might be the thing that, on the rough days, I would say is the most exhausting part of being self-employed. But it still holds true. I hear a lot of people talk about risk tolerance when they talk about someone's likelihood of succeeding as starting a small business or growing a business. But it's never felt quite right to me. Because frankly, I absolutely do not have a high tolerance for risk. And yet here I am, 14 years later. So how is this possible? Sitting in a therapist's office in 2019, it was reflected to me that what I do have a high tolerance for is change. As Marie Forleo puts it, I believe that everything is figure-outable. If we approach this whole making a living from the things we make thing with nearly unending curiosity instead of pessimism, I wager it just might be the silver bullet everyone seems to be looking for. What if the next time you post something on Instagram and are presumably disappointed in the reach or the views or the likes or whatever other data point you want to pay attention to? What if instead of adding to the echo chamber of artists online griping about how the algorithm is garbage and Instagram doesn't work anymore, which will naturally get you plenty of comments and likes and responses because there are clearly plenty of other artists who feel the same way, well, spoiler, that will simply tell the algorithm robots that it's other artists that they should show your post to, which is fine if you sell your work to other artists, but if you don't, well, anyway, what if instead of defaulting to defeat, we try to default to curiosity? Why might it be that the type of posts that worked so well for you a year ago are not performing so well today? What has changed? What are the social media platforms doing differently? What are you doing differently? How have your goals changed in the last year? What do you actually need from that social media platform for those goals to work? An endless list of curious questions to forever try and answer the ultimate question. Why? Now, I wanted to end this episode right there because it felt really fancy. But real quick, I want to clarify in my case for curiosity here. I am not suggesting a good vibes only approach to self-employment. There are plenty of hard days, and pretending otherwise doesn't help us either. But acknowledging a hard day or a hard month or a hard year is different from pessimism. Giving ourselves a day off or maybe a week off because things are feeling too heavy and the burnout is starting to rear its ugly head yet again, well, that's healthy. But assuming that even if you try something new, it's not going to work, or that a suggestion from a colleague or an educator, something that somebody told us to maybe try and solve a problem that we told them about, just assuming that it's not going to work for us because our problem is different than the same problem other people also have. Assuming defeat and sort of trying anyway is a completely different energy to bring to the table than curiosity. Curiosity doesn't place blame. Curiosity is neutral. Curiosity doesn't think of something as a win or a loss, or a failure or a success. Curiosity simply gathers the information from an experience, good or bad, and files it away until it might be needed. I know that pessimism is easier. And I know there's probably plenty of data points and experiences to support it. But after teaching over 200 makers in our Makers Photography Styling System course, as they learn to tackle the arduous task of photographing their work, and as I continue to have the amazing opportunity of journeying alongside about 100 makers in the community who are each trying to figure out their own unique path for making and selling their work these last 3 years and counting, I've noticed a trend. The makers that see the most growth, whether it be in their own skills, in their business, financially, mentally, emotionally, as a side hustler, a full-timer, a newbie, or a veteran, those makers are always the most curious ones. Okay, so this episode feels like it got a bit more philosophical rather than the pragmatic bullet list that I first had in mind. So let me leave you with a bit more tangible list of things that Francesco and I are currently doing differently than last year before I wrap this up. Number 1, we have less markets in October and November in order to prepare for holiday sales season. Number 2, we are no longer always taking all of our items to every market. We adjust our inventory and making schedule depending on the style of any given show. Number 3, we're organizing the booth display by object instead of color. Number 4, we are focused on bigger and more well-known markets as compared to the shows we did last year. No markets at all have the word craft in them or in the overall style of their marketing. Now, there's nothing wrong with those shows, but we have learned for ourselves personally, it's just not where our ideal people tend to shop. Number 5, we're only opening the website shop at specific times, effectively treating it like a virtual market in a way. And number 6, we are using social media for one specific goal instead of broad general audience growth. On the whole, while it's hard to clearly explain it for you, this year, as I sit, or more accurately stand, in our booth for 8 hours a day on a weekend, sometimes busy, sometimes slow, sometimes with someone who's in love with our work and pulling out their credit card without a second thought, and sometimes with someone who is, frankly, appalled by a bud vase costing $25. Either way, overall, this year just feels more settled, strategic, organized, planned, better. It feels like we really did learn things last year, and manage to pay attention to the right things in order to take the next steps forward towards the type of business we want. It might not be entirely independently sustainable just yet, but it's that forward momentum that's most important. Because at the end of the day, alongside the necessity for curiosity, the other secret, quote unquote, to success often is simply time. But that opens up a whole other topic. So for now, my friends, I better get off the computer and start reloading the trailer for yet another market weekend. Now, I had the best of intentions to have a handy PDF download ready for you with this episode of the Launch Series with our market prep checklist so that you never wind up in the middle of your own booth setup realizing you forgot the power drill you needed to assemble your whole display. You know, hypothetically. But it is market season, and while I am so grateful for our sponsors and our community members who help make the production of this podcast possible, it isn't yet the main bread and butter either. So the time I needed to create that free PDF instead got filled with the time needed for weighing out clay and wedging that clay and mixing new batches of glaze. It's still on my to-do list, though, so I will be making this free PDF download for you, not only with our pre-market checklist, but also a little bit on how I research the markets that we choose to go to. So if you want to be sure to snag that as soon as I'm done with it, then you're going to want to make sure that you are on our email newsletter list, which you can join at makersplaybook.com/newsletter. The makers on our email list are always the first people to find out about new resources. That was slightly misspoken. The email list is the second group to find out about new resources, if I'm being honest, because our community members are always the very, very first. Because frankly, in reality, half the time the ideas of the new resources we create are actually coming straight from the community. But I digress. If now isn't the right time to come join my favorite neighborhood on the internet for you, then absolutely get on the newsletter list for access to free resources by visiting makersplaybook.com/newsletter. And one more quick announcement that is incredibly exciting. Next week, the podcast is going to be a little bit different. So along with signing up for the newsletter, you should definitely make sure you've got automatic downloads turned on for this show, or that you're following the Maker's Playbook if you're not already in your podcast app, because you are not going to want to miss out on what's coming next week. All I can say right now is that there might just be a large, historic institution you may have heard of before involved in the episode. Okay, with that cliffhanger, a big thank you to our sponsors for helping keep this podcast going. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online source for research and inspiration, featuring photos of objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great source for students and teachers. To find out more, visit www.rosenfieldcollection.com. This episode is also sponsored by the Archie Bray Clay Business, home of Bray Patch, a ceramic patching material that is best used for filling cracks and bonding breaks. Bray Patch can be applied to either green or bisqueware and fired up to cone 10. It fires paper white, but can be tinted using your chosen clay body and be covered by opaque glaze or slip. Order anytime online at archiebrayclay.com. Audio post-production of this podcast is made possible by help from Christy Kotzvan, with promotional material assistance from Queenie Maliki. The Maker's Playbook podcast is recorded on the original homelands of the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee people. were the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality. Because together, we've got this.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.